All right, let's get underway. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight's Capacity Series call. As you might know, this is part of a monthly webinar series that alternates between two overarching themes. One is how to be an executive director, and the second is how to be a board member, right? These are some of the foundational and fundamental questions that a lot of us ask ourselves in the nonprofit community. And tonight we're here joined by some incredible guests to get to some answers on the question, what is the role of the board treasurer? How do we want to understand that, and how can we use this in our respective environmental organizations? I'm Rob Barnes. I'm your host for tonight. I'm the Executive Director of Capacity Building Institute, and I'm joined by a great group of guests tonight who will be joining me. First up is Helen Turnbull, who's the Secretary-Treasurer at Wintergreen Studios. Helen, would you like to say hi to the audience here?
Hello, everyone, and welcome.
Welcome, Helen. Very excited to have you as part of tonight's discussion. We've also got Barb King. Barb is the former Executive Director at Watersheds Canada and is now Director of Programs and Partnerships at Watersheds Canada. Barb, over to you to say hello.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us, Barb. And last but not least, Kristina Inrig, President of Sustainable Capacity Foundation. I know Kristina has rich experience with the role of the treasurer as well as many other board roles. So Kristina, would you like to say a few words of hello to the audience tonight?
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be back to this monthly series, and happy to be here.
All right. So why are we talking about the board treasurer role? Well, when it comes to environmental nonprofits, as I'm sure all of us who are in the sector can appreciate, money management matters a lot. A board treasurer is responsible for overseeing an organization's financial matters. And so this has everything to do with a broad range of issues, from legal requirements to reporting to the board to putting in place the right controls to ensure organizational health. So we're going to have a few words from Hannah Rockburn at Capacity Building Institute just to introduce the organization, and after that we're going to dive in very deep to the role of the board treasurer. Hannah, would you like to say a few words about the organization hosting tonight's call?
For sure. Thank you, Rob. So welcome, everyone. My name is Hannah Rockburn, and I'm the Operations Manager here at Capacity Building Institute. So as Rob touched on, this is what this webinar is part of our capacity series that we do on a monthly basis. And here at Capacity Building Institute, in general, we help provide capacity building training and support for small shop environmental nonprofit organizations and hope to bolster Canada's environmental sector. So we do a range of training programs for anywhere from nonprofit leaders, executive directors, to anyone that's just maybe starting out in the nonprofit sector that's maybe just coming out from university or college and want to kind of get their foot in the door on the nonprofit sector. And our mission is to train 10,000 environmental leaders by 2030. And you guys are a part of that number by attending tonight, so thank you for that. And we look forward to speaking with you and getting your questions later in the evening. So why do we do it? So like challenges of climate change and nature loss and species decline, they're dominating the headlines, and a lot of the work that you guys and environmental nonprofit organizations are doing are very important. And it's also important that leaders and staff and volunteers that they be able to balance that urgency and scale of the issues that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and that they have the resources and training they need to be able to confront and do the best job that they can be. And so our goal is then to help the Canadian environmental community be equal to this vital task of helping the environment and being prepared and having the resources to do that. So we believe that Canada's environment deserves all that it can, all the help it can get, that the environmental nonprofits play a vital role in this effort, and that obviously training matters to keep everyone well organized and prepared, as well as, small shops, they make a big difference. You guys are on the ground. You do the practical work, and we want to support that. And there's always lots to do and always more to do. And to help with that and to help accomplish our goals, we offer a variety of different programs. So we have our flagship program, which is the Capacity Building Certificate Program. that's aimed for environmental leaders, program managers, executive directors. And we have our intern training program, which helps with interns that are just getting into the environmental sector that don't maybe know much about it, that are just getting their foot in the door, as well as we have our fundraising intensive, which is more of a direct one-on-one deep dive in fundraising for your organization and tips and tricks and working together to be able to best practices for fundraising for your organization. We have the Capacity Series webinars, which we are doing tonight, as well as a leadership training program that's aimed for new managers that are, they've taken the internship training, they have their foot in the door a little bit, but they need a little bit more guidance and tools to start their leadership role. So those are the programs that we're currently offering to help reach our goals. Then we have some amazing trainers, which a couple of them are on the call tonight. We have Bart King and Kristina, and usually we have Sam LaPrad's our regular host that does these series. So as well as we also have lots of guest speakers to help enrich the training and materials that we bring to our students. We have also helped train, as I said, a number of organizations and individuals and folks such as Dominique from Youth Climate Lab, and this is the testimonial from her experience, as well as we have trained hundreds of interns over the past few years with our internship training program that are just starting in the sector. And this is a quote from Anna from 2020 and how she had touched on that the training program not only helped her become more successful in her role, but it also allowed her to expand her network and to join a community of people that share the same goals and aspirations as her. And so that's one of the things that we strive for, is not only providing the tools and resources, but also developing that network and that connection. And then as mentioned, this is our Capacity Series. It's free, it's online, it's once a month. And these are just a few of our guest speakers that we've had on this show series already. And if you are interested from what you hear tonight and haven't had a chance to check out our past sessions, you can go to our YouTube channel and check out the past recordings. And this is just a shout out to our managers and mentors, as we do have a team of people helping out here and making everything possible, as well as our board members and our partner organizations. And then a couple of save the dates. So our next session will be Monday, October 3rd at 4 p.m. Eastern, as well as November 7th at 6 p.m. So we want to tailor these experiences for you guys to see what you want and how we can help. So if you have any specific inquiries or suggestions on what we can address in these series topics, you can send your questions and feedback to Robb Barnes. And with that, I will pass it back over to Robb.
All right, Hannah, thanks so much. So why don't we start the night off by hearing from Helen Turnbull. Helen, thanks again for joining us from Wintergreen Studios tonight. The first question is about your journey. How were you introduced to the role of the board treasurer?
It was really unexpected. We needed a treasurer, and I stepped up to be the treasurer. It wasn't that I came to it with any skill set. I just came to it, to the role with the commitment to seeing Wintergreen Studios continue as an organization, and there are roles that are essential, and one of them is treasurer, and I wanted to be helpful, and so agreed to take on that role.
And Helen, can you tell me about your learning journey there? You said you didn't have, the background there at the beginning, but you stepped up into the role, which is obviously the most important thing, right? Is being there and having that drive. What did you learn when you stepped into the role? Did you look at webinars or take courses, or how did you learn how to become an effective board treasurer?
Well, Wintergreen had its start in 2007. I was involved in dreaming of Wintergreen before Wintergreen became an entity. And so, at the outset, we were just learning as we went. We knew we had a clear vision, but we also were willing to strike out. And so the first few years, I wasn't the treasurer at the outset, but when we lost our treasurer, then that's when I stepped into the role. We've had some strong support from the outset, excellent bookkeeping, accounting, people with those financial strengths. But I believe it was 2011 that Kristina introduced herself to Wintergreen Studios. And by so doing, opened the doors to incredible learning. That has really made all the difference for me in terms of feeling more confident in the role. And that was the work that she did with us through capacity building.
Great. Now, Kristina, over to you. Thinking about that, I mean, you've helped so many organizations over the years. How did you learn the ropes, and what were the lessons that you were drawing from when you learned about the role of the board treasurer?
Yeah, I would say my first role was not actually as the treasurer. It was as an executive director of a small organization, and they were going through some financial troubles. But pretty soon after that role, I took on a volunteer role as a treasurer of this is kind of the worst case scenario, an organization that was in deficit, had been in deficit for 3 years in a row. And of course, nobody wanted the job of treasurer. Nobody wants the job of treasurer anyway, right? That's kind of what we find, which is why I think it's great that, you know, Helen's here today to share, you know, she was a reluctant treasurer. She didn't even want to necessarily be in that role, but she was asked to, and she said yes. So those are the best kind of people, Helen, people who say yes, even when they're not sure and they're willing to learn. In my case, I started first with an organization that, you know, I was learning the ropes about finances, and then I encountered another small organization that was struggling financially and had run a deficit 3 years in a row, and basically nobody would sign up for the job. And so I think that was an experience, a learning experience for me from the ground up as to how to kind of help straighten them out financially.
How about you, Barb? Did you find yourself drawn to the role of the board treasurer, or did you find yourself in a situation similar to Helen's or maybe Kristina's?
Yeah, for me, I haven't taken the official treasurer position on a board, but I have been on multiple boards of directors and, you know, working with the treasurer and other board members. But for me, it was really working with our board treasurer. So when I came into, you know, the executive director position at Watersheds Canada, I really didn't have a strong financial background. And yet I had a really strong treasurer. So he was a CFO at a big company. So he's coming in with all this language, you know, and for me, it was a real learning curve in terms of how, you know, to get a handle on the financials and whatnot. So, and really understanding that.
I think one of the myths, just to build on what Barb is saying, is people think they have to have an accountant on their board, or they have to have a lawyer on their board, and often people don't feel comfortable taking the role of treasurer because they say, well, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not a CPA, and you know, I think, I don't want to speak for all accountants, but I think people who work in the accounting industry, they probably don't want to spend their volunteer time also doing the work that they do all day, right? And so I think it's unrealistic to expect that every organization, especially small organizations across our country, are going to all have accountants as their treasurers. I think it's an unrealistic idea that we should just toss out and just kind of embrace this idea that, you know, learning the financials can be hard, but it's an opportunity, and we want to share the learning with others. And so I think a willingness of spirit is the most important criteria. There's lots to talk about here, but that is the starting point, I think.
Yeah, and to be clear, our last two treasurers of the organization do not have a financial background. And, you know, they stepped up kind of saying, you know, I don't really have a very strong financial background. I'm not an accountant. We don't have an accountant on our board at this time. And, you know, they were willing to dig in and learn the role. But they also had strong financial support in terms of bookkeeping and financial management surrounded by them.
Yeah, and here's a question for the group. I mean, so we talk about accountants, right? And then, of course, there are auditors. There are people in the financial world who we often interact with in the nonprofit community. But then there's this role of the board treasurer. Why does the board treasurer position matter? What's important about this role being on the board? Would anyone like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I could, no, go ahead, Helen.
I guess just from my perspective in terms of, the part I see myself playing in as part of that team is really more to do with being very clear about the vision of Wintergreen, being a part of the ongoing workings of the organization and bringing that broader view to our financial discussions in terms of, how we use the resources that we have to further our vision. And, so it isn't, I'm not the one who's bringing the financial expertise, but I do offer a broader perspective than perhaps our bookkeeper or our accountants would be able to bring to the table.
Yes, thanks, Helen. And by the way, I just want to second the mention that Hannah just put in the chat. If folks have questions, we are going to turn this over to the to a Q&A panel at about the 6:35 mark. So watch for that. But also put your questions in the Q&A, and we'd love to have you as part of the discussion. Any other thoughts in terms of why the position matters?
Yeah, I mean, for our organization, and we've been very small. When I started out, we were about to run a deficit. Very small organization that has grown over the last 10 years that I was involved with it. But the treasurer position's always been really critical in helping to kind of set the budget. Working with staff if you do have staff members. If not, you're working with the other board members to look at the budget for the year. And then, throughout that year is working with your team, other fellow board members or staff members, just to see, are you on track financially? So we meet with our treasurer before we have a full board meeting. So we'll sit down and I'll sit down with my treasurer. We'll go over the proposed budget, get some feedback, and kind of go back and forth before we present it to the board, so we can present it to the board as a team. And same thing with regular kind of financial updates throughout the year. We send that off to the treasurer first, set up a meeting. Is there any questions about this? This is where we're on track. So just kind of having that second, set of eyes and scrutiny on the finances.
So Kristina, when I hear from Helen and Barb, I hear that, the importance of sharing a vision, the idea of that second set of eyes. And you mentioned, Kristina, the idea that, you don't need that financial background to play this role in an organization, and it's a tremendously important one. And we don't want to scare people away from the position, right? We're in the business of building capacity. But I wanted to ask you, Kristina, what should everyone know before putting up their hand to become a treasurer of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you want to know, number one, not all organizations are created equally in terms of what the expectation of the treasurer is. So I think it's hard to give a blanket assessment across the country of all environmental groups will have treasurers who do this or that. Like, it is very different. So the first thing you would want to know is to find out, like, okay, who are the key players involved in the financials for my organization that I'm considering being the treasurer for? Number one, is there an executive director, or is this a completely volunteer-based team, and I'm sort of the main person doing financials? Is there a bookkeeper, or is the expectation for the treasurer that they actually want you to do data entry, which is often the case. There are hundreds of volunteer treasurers across the country who manage the books of the organization in addition to providing the reporting. And there are other people who would say, like, well, if you want me to be the bookkeeper, there's no way that I'm going to sign up to be the treasurer. So that's a big difference, right? If you're going to be the bookkeeper, you obviously need some expectation and understanding of how to do the entries. Otherwise, it'd be very hard for you to do that work. In most cases, for small organizations with a few staff, they might have a part-time coordinator or a full-time executive director, and then a bookkeeper who works on the side to help support the work. And I think that's the case in most of the organizations that we're talking about here today, where there is a separate person from the treasurer who does the data entry, who does the payroll, who does the MERX payments to the government, the mandatory employer-related costs is what I mean by MERX, and at the same time, you as the treasurer are wanting to be the one who's going to bring the pertinent financial information to the board at the regular board meetings. So just going back to your question, Rob, the first thing you want to know is what is the makeup of who's touching the finances within your organization? How many people are involved? And then really, are they looking for a treasurer who's a governance role, or are they looking for a working board member who's going to actually do the data entry on the finances? And there's not a one size fits all for this. I've gone to 50 different organizations to talk about finances, and they all have probably 50 different ways of how they do this. So that's the one thing that we should recognize and celebrate, is that we all do things a little bit differently. But in terms of helping to be streamlining or thinking through, like, what are some of the procedural matters that we need to think about as treasurers? Well, the first thing is you're the person at the board meeting, and if you have a paid executive director, they're probably going to be there as well, but your bookkeeper is not going to be at the board meeting in almost every case. So you're the sort of second person, or in some cases the first person, to give that treasurer's report, to present the financials to the board. Often if you have a paid ED, they're going to be the ones who will run through the numbers and really go line by line. You're there to kind of help present it, but you're also providing that voice and that second, as Barb said, that second set of eyes on the numbers. The other really important role for the treasurer is around year end, in terms of the two different things: the financial statements that you have prepared, and the second one is around the budget that you're preparing for the actual year. Again, if you have a paid ED, you're going to be working with the executive director to develop those. But certainly I've been to several meetings with Helen and Rena and Monica over at Wintergreen, where we've been working on the budget together. And so it is a shared and collaborative process. And I can tell you that Helen's perspective as the treasurer is extremely valuable at those budget planning meetings. So again, at the time where you're coming up to year end, you want to look back on how the year went. So helping with those financial statements. If you have an auditor, they're going to do the heavy lifting. And if you have a bookkeeper, they're going to do the even more heavy lifting. But you're going to review those documents as they come in. And then also, as you look ahead to the next year, you're thinking about the budget. So those are kind of some steps in the process that you're going to be actively involved in. But like anything, like many of us who take jobs as EDs and are just learning it as we go, you don't have to have everything figured out the moment you step into the treasurer role. There are lots of resources and lots of tools to enhance this role.
Yeah, it's a great point, Kristina. So much of us learn as we go, and so much of our knowledge comes from this direct experience. Now, Helen, you said you jumped right in. Is there anything that you wish you had known before accepting the position of treasurer for your organization?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would have liked to have had a better handle on understanding how to set a budget. I didn't have that awareness. However, I wasn't alone. So we, our president, Rena Eupitis, did, fortunately, and fairly early in the whole process, we also had the opportunity to work with Kristina. So we had a bookkeeper who's been with us right from the outset since 2007, and that was invaluable. And so it was Rena, our bookkeeper, there was coaching that was happening as we worked together to prepare a budget, and then the responsibility I had to present that budget at our board meetings. So, but I didn't have that prior learning, and it didn't really limit me in the sense of it would only be limiting if there wasn't a willingness to learn, but the desire to want to perform that role to the best of my ability was really all I needed in order to acquire the learning that was necessary to keep us moving forward.
So Barb, you mentioned earlier that you never formally played the role of treasurer, but of course you've seen organizations from multiple angles, including many years as the executive director of Watersheds Canada. Now I wonder, from that vantage point, from the executive director vantage point, what are key takeaways that you have about the importance of the role of the treasurer?
Yeah, and I've been on a number of volunteer organizations. I'm going to pull from that as well. I think one of the big ones, and I know Kristina mentioned that, and I mentioned that, two of us were involved in organizations that were about to run a deficit. So, really keeping a handle on, I think, in terms of where we're at with the budget as we go through the year, that's, a really important aspect of what role, the treasurer can have for the organization. So, for example, many years ago at one of the organizations I was involved with was, well, give me a balanced budget. So, of course, the board is looking at an Excel spreadsheet. Well, is that truly a balanced budget? Is that money actually in the door throughout the fiscal year? So I think that's probably one of the most important aspects of the treasurer would be to check in, and it's, if you were writing a grant, it's in your budget. Did we get that grant? Or, are we spending, funds within the organization that are outside of the budget? So it's really having those kind of quarterly check-ins and pivoting as needed. But I think that's maybe something that, to talk about a little bit further on in terms of the role.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. And thanks to folks for putting those questions in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. We're going to hand it over to a Q&A portion in about 5 minutes. Kristina, I'm wondering about, maybe if we could zoom out a bit. We've been talking about the role of the board treasurer, but one of the functions seems to be about developing that literacy on the board, that financial literacy. So from your experience, Kristina, how important is board financial literacy?
I think it is really important that it's not just the treasurer who has a knowledge of the finances, or at least knows how to read a financial statement. That would be the first thing. And in fact, one of the things I also encourage people to do is to simplify their financials a little bit. If you've got a million different line items, it can be really hard to follow as various board members are at different stages of learning. So I find when you can collapse certain categories and make it a little bit more simplified, if possible, have your balance sheet on one page and your profit and loss statement on the second page, not like 6 pages of financials to look through. I mean, if you've got tons of money, then great. But generally speaking, you don't need to get super complicated, and follow the same, kind of standard process in terms of every time you're reviewing these to be looking at the same documents, or do a comparison with previous fiscal periods or previous periods to help do that. But just be careful about how much information you're presenting, because I've been on some boards where they give you everything plus class reports, and they've got 16 different projects, so you're getting 8-page reports, and there's just no way that everyone's going to follow what's going on there. So the most important pieces are your budget, your balance sheet, and your sort of year-to-date financials. Those sort of 3 pieces, they can be combined in one set of documents, or maybe you just keep your budget separate and not necessarily incorporate it into your financials as you go. But those are the kind of 3 pieces you should be reviewing. And I would just say that, all of the board members, it would be important to kind of have an understanding around, number one, what's required by your organization, like at what level of financial review is required. So if you're a really small shop and you're bringing in less than $50,000 a year, and you're just preparing the financial statements internally or using a third-party compilation report, that's a pretty simple, kind of straightforward spot to be managing your books internally. And then you get, depending on the province you're in, and depending on if you're federally incorporated or provincially incorporated, there will be different levels of financial review required. So I think it's important, of course, for the treasurer to know that, but I think it's important for the board members also to know what they can expect. Can they expect an internally prepared financial document or something external by a public accountant once a year. And then kind of learning the ropes a little bit on how to read that balance sheet. What is that statement of financial position and what does it mean? And similarly, the financials as well.
Thinking of that, Helen, are there any techniques that you've used over the years to get your board on the same page when it comes to finances? Any tools, any tricks, any tips for the audience?
I would say I'm actually using the very strategies that Kristina has spoken to, presenting the budget in such a manner that it's easy to understand. It's organized into under headings that we take a look at. We have a baseline, we have a base budget, we have an expanded budget if the grants, the donations, will allow us, and we also do a comparison. So we always look at the previous years, and those columns, when it's presented, that's consistent from one board meeting to the next board meeting. And that continuity really allows all of us to be on the same page in terms of our understanding, and keeping things separate, keeping, the money that is coming in, what we have, our profits, and then what our expenditures are, and those things are clearly delineated. So it's easier to have a clear understanding of where we're at from one board meeting to the next, which for us are 4 times a year.
How about you, Barb? From the other side of the table, as well as your roles on boards, have you ever used any techniques to get the board all on the same page when it came to finances?
Yeah, I mean, using QuickBooks as a tool. So our treasurer, I was kind of working with him and mentoring him on, understanding how to get into the finances so that he can go in at any time. And I think having that transparency is really important. So giving them access. So if you want to look at the books, shop around at any time, everything is in our financial management system. And then, kind of working with him and actually, teaching him like how to go in, look at the different reports, and then bringing in experts. So we've brought in Kristina and other people at different times on board development opportunities around financial management. So some of our board members had flagged that, they didn't really understand, the financial statements. So we could have, the auditor come in and do a presentation that would talk about how to read the financial statements. What does all of this mean? So I think some of that capacity building is really important so that everybody's able to understand, the financials. Because I think once you really understand all the language and information and how to read the different financial statements, the balance sheet, the profit and loss, it all sounds big and scary. But it's really, what money comes in the door versus money goes out the door, where are we sitting, what money, is not yet come in, so that's a receivable. And it's just, some of that language, for me was completely new. So when I was sitting there as a new executive director who didn't know what the heck I was doing around, financial management, and I had the CFO using, some of this financial language, it was something I had to learn very quickly. And then, now I can kind of look back and say, oh, I can talk like that too. But it's really, I think, engaging the board and just getting them, all the information that they need and, coming in. I think the auditor can be a fantastic person to come in and present the financial statements rather than, having us present them on our own or try to understand them. If they can present them and explain exactly, how to read those statements and what everything means, that's probably a good first step. Or someone like Kristina and the presentation she's.
Thanks, Barb. Okay, so we've got some questions from the audience. And here's a great question from John. How often should the board of directors expect a treasurer's report? Should it be on every board of directors agenda? What do you think? Anyone want to weigh in here?
I think the first question is, how often is your board meeting? So I'm always, you've heard me probably say this before right here in this room, that I'm an advocate of maybe less frequent board meetings, maybe having them every 2 months or every 3 months, so quarterly board meetings. And I don't think that you should ever be reviewing financials as an entire board on a monthly basis. It's just too frequent to be able to get a full picture. The ED maybe is doing that, but I think as a board as a whole, it doesn't even give you enough time to properly reconcile and complete your previous month before getting ready for the next one. So you're wasting a lot of time just putting out reports. So I think the sweet spot would be quarterly for me. But those groups that are meeting bi-monthly too, you might prep something as well for those.
Any difference of opinion here in terms of the frequency for the board of directors for the treasurer report?
We're in the same page, so we kind of look at them, 3-4 times a year, depending.
Okay. We have another question on duration or length, and there's a question around vacancies in the role, right? And we're getting down to kind of, effective nonprofit management questions, right? So what's the longest period that there can be a vacancy in the treasurer position in a not-for-profit? And is there any difference between a not-for-profit or charity in this respect?
So my comment would be you need to look at your bylaws first, because that's going to give you an indication of any officer role, what the rules are around vacancies. So it is a little bit of a case-by-case basis. The only time where I've seen an issue of having a certain number of vacancies is if it puts you below the legal requirement of having a certain number of board members. So in the case of that board that I was on, where they had a deficit, they separately had an issue a few years later. This is where I learned all of the things I needed to not do. No, just kidding. Notice I haven't named which board this is, but so they kept falling below 3 board members. Actually, in their case, it was 5. They kept falling below 5 board members, which their bylaw considered to be the legal minimum of board members. And so they had to call a members meeting every single 60 days and then did that for almost 2 years until they were able to get back up to 6 or 7 board members. So that was a legal requirement, and it was also part of their bylaws. So I think what's more important is not so much what the legal requirement is, because the legal requirement will probably stretch you further. I think it's more around best practice. And I would say you wouldn't want to leave a treasurer role vacant for more than a year, in my opinion. Obviously that's even that's a long time, but sometimes it is one of the harder roles to fill. And that kind of goes a little bit to Rena's next comment around there may be opportunities to combine it. And I would also just note, like, secretary treasurer is a combined role, but the secretary and the treasurer are the 2 positions on a board that don't actually have to be held by board members. They are commonly held by staff members. And so although I think, again, going back to best practice, I think if at all possible, your treasurer should be a board member. But if you're really struggling and you're finding you're having like a 6 month, 8 months where you don't have a position filled, you could fill the role of treasurer with a volunteer or a staff member who is not a board member. So I just wanted to flag that difference for you. The secretary and treasurer are 2 of the officer roles that can commonly be held by non-board members. I don't want to hog the floor here though, Helen and Barb, if you guys want to add anything about that.
I think you got it covered.
Hearing no vociferous objections, we'll turn the floor to Helen, actually, because the next question from Rena really gets at that kind of combined role of secretary and treasurer. And as we mentioned at the front, and you are a secretary treasurer, not just the treasurer, right? So, Helen, reflecting on your work with Wintergreen, and the way in which those 2 roles are intertwined, basically, to what extent has the secretary role affected your role as treasurer and vice versa? And can you speak a bit to that crossover?
Well, it's interesting. For me, the 2 are very blended. There are some clear differences, and certainly when we're talking budget, that is definitely the treasurer's responsibility. But as secretary, There are jobs that I do, for example, with donations where I'm writing receipts, and with those receipts, I'm writing thank you notes. And, that's one of the instances where it feels more like the role of the secretary, and particularly when it comes to expressions of gratitude in the forms of notes that are written, but they are very much driven by the financial needs of the board, and that is the donations that come to us from many individuals across a broad spectrum of ability to contribute, from very small donations to very large donations. So that plays a big role in the finances of our organization, but it also is an important to recognize that in a meaningful way, which expressions of gratitude in written form, handwritten form, we feel it's very important. So I tend to step up when the need is there. And so if it's if we're preparing budget, and we do this as a community, it isn't, I'm not working independently. The president, the executive director, myself, Kristina has been just invaluable to us for a very long time. We're now working quite independently, but we still do check-ins with Kristina to get feedback on the work that we're doing, and that makes a really big difference for us as we continue to improve all of our documentation, the information gathering in terms of keeping track of people who have come to visit Wintergreen, who then end up becoming donors and having a record of those individuals. So it's, that, again, it feels sometimes like the role of secretary in updating that information, and yet at the same time, I recognize it as an important part of our annual giving campaign, for example.
I will say that Helen writes the best thank you letters. So if anybody wants to test her out on that, give a nice donation to Wintergreen. She is a real gem for the organization from that perspective as well.
Well, I was going to say too, Helen, that answer, we talked at the front end about, some of the pitfalls or some of the worries that people might have about this position, but this really lightens it up and talks about the human element, right? That the importance of those touch points and thanking donors. Now, not to go back to the dark side too quickly, but we just talked about, some of the benefits of the Secretary-Treasurer position. But on the other hand, and this is a question that John raises, what about the legal liabilities involved in the position, right? Like we have these organizations, we're getting directors and operators insurance, we're talking about fiduciary responsibilities. What should we be thinking about when it comes to the role of the treasurer and when it comes to legal liability for the organization? Any thoughts there from the group?
Yeah, I mean, the fiduciary duty is what you hit on, Rob, and that really just means that you're acting in the interests of the organization. So working in your best way to do what's best for the organization. And so specifically, that means ensuring that those financial statements come to the board on a regular basis. Because if you haven't been reviewing them, or if you're only reviewing them once a year or not even once a year, they kind of get swept under the rug and you don't actually look at them, that you could argue would not be doing your fiduciary duty in terms of bringing that to the board. But that duty is not just the treasurer's responsibility. Fiduciary duty is everybody's responsibility on the board. And it's not, in cases where things like fraud happen or there's major concerns financially, again, it's the responsibility of the entire board of directors to be paying attention to the organization. And at the same time, I would say that part of the duty of a treasurer, if you're taking on that role, is to strive and to learn as much as possible. So no one's saying you have to start the role having all the answers. But if there are areas where you really don't know what you're looking at, being open about that and then taking the steps needed to learn about that is doing your duty for sure.
Thanks, Kristina. So now, if we can, let's turn it over to Emma from Sustainable Capacity Foundation. Tonight, Sustainable Capacity Foundation is our sponsor, and Emma has just a few words of sponsor content to share. Emma, please take it away.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a stakeholder engagement coordinator working with Sustainable Capacity Foundation. So I'm actually just going to briefly talk to you guys a little bit about a new opportunity that the Sustainable Capacity Foundation has just begun rolling out. And tomorrow is actually our official launch. So we're very excited to be launching the Faithfully Green Fund. So this is a new opportunity for investors to help with funding retrofit projects within the Ottawa area. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about ourselves. So this is actually a collaboration in partnership with us, the Sustainable Capacity Foundation, with also our close partner, Greening Sacred Spaces. So Greening Sacred Spaces helps with faith communities, with educational and spiritual dimensions of greening and the how-to side of audits, retrofits, and reducing the carbon footprint of sacred spaces. So they kind of help, especially with the community bond, on the faith institution side, on building relationships with institutions, and they also have the energy benchmarking program, which helps with measuring institutions' energy use and how they can, which retrofits would be best for their organization and things like that. We here at the Sustainable Capacity Foundation, we help with supporting small nonprofits, in particular environmental organizations across Canada. Our main mission is to offer grants and impact investments to support the environmental sector with a very specific focus on small shop capacity building. So our vision is really to be a leader in capacity grant making and to be kind of a leader in impact investing, and we are hoping to also transition this community bond. So it's one of the main barriers that we've found with faith institutions is that they don't tend to have capital up front to take on major projects. So this can be obviously a very big barrier, as the many of these retrofit projects are very expensive. So certain things like solar panel installation or EV chargers and things like that are very difficult for faith spaces to pay for up front. So we are trying to help by creating an opportunity to give loans to help to support these projects. So the main way we are going to be doing that is through community bond. And our main goal is to help with, is to raise over $2 million in the next year to help with these projects. So community bond is a social finance tool that is mainly used by charities, nonprofits, and co-ops to financially and socially, or to finance socially and environmentally impactful projects. It's similar in many ways to a traditional bond. They're an interest-bearing loan from an investor, which has a set rate of return in a fixed term. And community bonds are a very long-standing way of fundraising, basically, for community projects. So how it works, basically, is that investors will purchase a bond to support the Faithfully Green Fund. Those bonds go kind of into a pool that are loaned out to faith communities. So these communities now have that capital, which they can use to fund these retrofit projects. Most of these projects will help save them money in either operational efficiencies or other types of efficiencies. Also, certain opportunities can actually help the institutions raise money, like, for example, solar panels can collect excess energy and you can sell that energy back to the grid, or with electric chargers that effectively you're charging people to use the energy, so you're making a little bit of a revenue there. So with that additional income, they can pay back those loans over a 5 to 7 year period. And that's also the length of the term of the investment. So if you invest, then you will be getting a yearly return over that 5 to 7 year period. And then at the end, the loan will be either mostly paid off, and then the principal is then repaid to the investor. And you can either choose to reinvest or whatever you'd like. So now kind of on to our main objectives. So we have kind of 5 things we really wanted to focus on with this project, and that's mainly to allow impact investors to contribute to environmentally friendly and community-focused projects. So that's a really big aspect of what we wanted to offer, is a chance to kind of like invest in a stake in your community. We wanted to really reduce the financial barriers for faith communities because, like we said, it's a very big struggle to kind of have that large capital up front to fund these projects. So we want to make it a little bit more accessible. We really want to help faith communities to complete retrofits, reduce emissions, and improve energy efficiency and save money. So it's obviously, we are an environmental organization and we are always focused on making our work more sustainable and also the work of those that we work with. We would like to create a model for investing in a faith community greening projects that can be replicated across Canada. So I kind of mentioned that before, but if this works out here in Ottawa, we really would like to expand this model and get other like cities and other communities involved in a similar type of model. And we really want to invest in diverse communities. So even though we were talking a lot about faith spaces, and usually the first thing that comes to mind is like Christians or like things like that, we really do want to focus on all types of faith communities. That includes like Indigenous communities as well. There isn't really like a limit in that sense. It's more about kind of that it's a community-oriented space that is meant for faith-based organizations. So just a quick little overview of the timeline. So this early fall, we'll be launching the Faithfully Green Funds. The official launch is tomorrow, so you will be learning a little bit more about that. We have already a couple projects sort of in the pipeline, but we'd like to get and develop a few more and sort of secure some more bond investments. By winter, we would like to have the capital call from institutions and to begin releasing the loans for the organizations that have applied. And then in the spring, we would like to have a completion of the cycle, and we would also hopefully have reached our goal by then. So this is just kind of a brief overview about how investors will be updated, as that was a question we received in the past. And so we have plans to do either quarterly impact updates, but also we'll have an annual impact report and all, of course, regular social media updates and things like that. And now to just talk about some projects. So one project that we actually have that's currently a work in progress is the installation of EV charging stations. So across 5 different United churches across Ottawa, we're installing 2 level 2 chargers per church. So that's 5 different communities that are getting the benefit of these new chargers, and it will also help create some income for some of these faith communities, which is really awesome. So I'm pretty sure, not sure exactly where we're at in that, but I'm pretty sure the chargers have been ordered and they're going to be starting to be installed in this winter. So that's really excited. And we also have just a couple other sample projects of things that churches or other faith spaces would be able to implement. And so to go over the investment series, we have 3 different series, and the lowest you can invest is actually even just $1,000. So if you had an interest in investing but you didn't really want to, or you have a lower budget, that's still super reasonable. But the more you invest, the higher your interest return rate will be. So the highest rate is for institutional investors at a 4% rate, and that's over a 7-year period. But obviously the minimum investment is a lot higher. So we are working with, as we talked about before, Greening Sacred Spaces, but we're also working with another organization called Tapestry Community Capital. We are a little new to developing and working with community bonds, and we really wanted to make sure we did it right. So we have partnered with Tapestry, who has over 20 years of experience working with community bonds specifically. So they are managing kind of the financial side of the bond, and we are doing more of the due diligence and working with Greening Sacred Spaces to make sure the projects are on track, to make sure the communities are involved, and that it's all going smoothly. I'd also just like to thank some of our supporters who help us out in many different ways, like Green Books, who helps with our finances, the McConnell Foundation, who helped with giving a bit of a seed grant to get us started, and obviously Sustainable Eastern Ontario, and then Faith in the Common Good, which is the parent organization to Greening Sacred Spaces. And then finally, we just had some frequently asked questions. So I won't go through these too in depth right now, just because I don't want to waste your guys' time.
Emma, if I can jump in, I think we've only got 2 minutes left, and we
can
close things out. So maybe, if possible, we can send this to the folks who've been on the call. Would that work? And then they can
definitely.
Wonderful.
So we can definitely do that. And then also, I'll just move on to this page. We do have an info session. So if you did think that this was an interesting opportunity and you wanted to learn more, on October 6th at 12 p.m. we will be having like a full information session where you can come ask questions and get a lot more details. So if that's of interest to you, and I will send the presentation for anyone to read over.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emma. And so Emma, on behalf of Sustainable Capacity Foundation, all about the community bond, super interesting and innovative idea. So we're running down the clock here at 6:59 by my watch. So we just have a minute to close out. I see Kristina just put on the chat that there's an info session as well for folks who are interested, and we will follow up with the folks who were on this call. We'll follow up with an email to give you a link. I guess in the minute that remains, I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to Helen, to Barb, to Kristina for being our guest tonight, to Emma for the presentation, and for Hannah for all the amazing tech support, and of course to the audience for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. We will post this on YouTube as we always do. It'll be a week or so after the initial call. And of course, we're always looking for your ideas, your suggestions, so please get in touch. You can find us at capacitybuilding.ca. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.